You know that feeling when you find something that seems too good to be true? The moment when you stumble upon something so perfect that it almost feels like it was meant to be. That's how I felt when my wife Sarah and I discovered the house. It wasn't anything like the overpriced mansions we'd been seeing for months. It wasn't a flashy, modern, or showy house. No, this was different. It was a quiet, old, colonial-style house, tucked away in a sleepy little neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It sat on a large plot of land, surrounded by thick trees, with an inviting, creaky front porch that seemed to whisper promises of peaceful mornings with coffee in hand. I remember the first time we saw the house. We had been looking for a place for months, feeling like we were running out of options when we came across the listing. The price? Shockingly low. It wasn't some rundown fixer-upper either. It was in great condition. In fact, everything about it seemed perfect. The layout was just what we wanted. The high ceilings, the hardwood floors, and the spacious kitchen where I could picture Sarah cooking dinner while I played with the kids. It was perfect. A little too perfect, maybe. But we were tired. Tired of the endless viewings, the deals that fell through, the places that just didn't feel right. This house felt like it was meant to be ours. The realtor was strange, though. He was an older man with a thick gray beard and a stiff, unblinking gaze. When he opened the door for us, he gave us a slow smile that never quite reached his eyes. He explained that the house had been on the market for years, but for some reason, it never sold. He didn't go into much detail, just a vague mention of unfortunate circumstances in the past. The kind of thing you'd let slide if you weren't really paying attention. I remember looking at Sarah, who seemed to have the same feeling I did. We didn't know what it was. Maybe it was just the realtor's odd demeanor or the way he lingered too long in the background, watching us as we toured the house. But we were desperate. We didn't want to let something as trivial as a weird realtor stop us from getting this dream home. "Do you think it's weird?" Sarah asked quietly as we stood on the porch, looking out at the property. I shrugged. "Not really. Every house has its story." So we put in an offer, and within days it was accepted. No haggling, no waiting. It was too easy. Looking back, that should have been the first red flag. But at the time, I was just thrilled to finally have a place of our own. We were ready to move in. The day we took possession, the house was empty, except for a few old pieces of furniture that seemed like they belonged in a museum. A faded armchair, a dust-covered writing desk. It felt like the house had been untouched for years, almost as if time had stopped the moment the previous owners left. We moved in without a second thought. The moment we turned the key and stepped inside, I felt a sense of, well, calm. Almost like this was where we were supposed to be. But little did I know, the unease was already starting to seep into the walls like a creeping fog. It started with the sounds. I didn't hear it at first, but Sarah did. She was the first to mention the strange noises at night. Little things, scratching at the walls, faint thumps coming from the upstairs hallway when no one was there. I chalked it up to the house settling. It's old after all. It creaks. It moans. I wasn't too concerned at first, but then things started to get stranger. One morning I walked into the kitchen to find the silverware drawer wide open, the spoons and forks neatly lined up on the counter. It wasn't how I had left them. Sarah hadn't been up yet, so I figured I must have just forgotten to close the drawer the night before. But the more it happened, the less it felt like an accident. Objects moved. The throw pillows on the couch, always in the same place when I left, would be scattered across the room. Books I knew I had left on one shelf would appear on the table. And the strangest part? It wasn't like we had guests. It was just the two of us in the house, and yet it felt like we were living with someone or something else. Then came the whispers. It wasn't something I could explain. Not at first. You know that feeling when you're half asleep and you hear someone call your name from the next room? It was like that, soft, almost imperceptible whispers. I thought I was imagining it, but Sarah heard it too. We both woke up in the middle of the night, hearing something, but not sure what. Something was wrong, and we both felt it, but we couldn't pinpoint what. The house didn't seem haunted. There were no signs of violence, no dark history to explain the odd occurrences. But something was off, something we couldn't see. The sense of dread was building, and neither of us could shake it. We couldn't understand why this beautiful house, our dream house, was slowly turning into a nightmare. But I wasn't ready to give up on it yet. There had to be an explanation, right? We didn't know it then, but we were about to uncover the truth behind the house that wouldn't sell, and it was more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. The strangest thing about the house was that it didn't seem to have any history at all, or at least none that we could find. We did what any new homeowners would do. We went to the local library to do some research. The house had been listed for sale for years, but the realtor had barely given us any background. The neighborhood itself was quiet, a mixture of families and older residents, but no one seemed to have anything noteworthy to say about the place. We talked to a couple of neighbors, and they were polite, but their answers were always vague, as if they were hesitant to speak of the house. It wasn't until we visited the local town hall that we uncovered something strange. Sarah had spent hours looking through old property records, hoping to find anything that might explain the house's inexplicable vacancy. It wasn't long before she found something, a single document buried in the back of a dusty file. It wasn't much, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. The previous owners had been a young couple, much like us, who moved in about 10 years ago. Their names were Michael and Claire Harrison. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. But the documents told a different story. The couple had bought the house at an unusually low price, just like us. But soon after moving in, they had begun experiencing strange occurrences, just like we were. At first, it was small things, furniture out of place, the occasional knocking sound in the walls. But then it escalated. There were reports of items being broken, objects moving around, and whispers that came from the corners of rooms. It sounded so familiar, just like what we were going through now. But the most unsettling part? The house had a reputation for ruining relationships. Every couple that moved in seemed to have their marriage fall apart, each one leaving after only a few months. Michael and Claire were no exception. After living in the house for just over a year, they separated. Claire left, and Michael stayed behind, but only for a few weeks longer. Then suddenly, they both disappeared. No one knew where they went. There were no records of them after they left the house. We were both struck by the same thought at the same time. What happened to them? The report didn't say. It simply stopped there. But Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something we hadn't yet uncovered. The unease in the house grew stronger after that. Little things that we could ignore before, like doors creaking open when we knew they had been shut, became harder to dismiss. The whispers got louder, more distinct, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting to speak to us. Sometimes it felt like the air itself was heavy, pressing in on us from every direction. But what unnerved us the most was the way time seemed to distort in the house. Days would pass in what felt like hours. Hours would stretch into what seemed like days. We'd wake up in the middle of the night, not remembering how we had gotten there, only to find the clock showing a time we didn't recognize. I started sleeping with a flashlight by my bed, not out of fear, but out of a strange need to be able to see, to have control over the dark corners of the room. Sarah noticed it too, the way I was becoming paranoid, constantly checking the locks, peering out of windows, listening intently for sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Then came the dreams. At first, it was just one. I remember waking up in a cold sweat, heart racing, with a vivid image burned into my mind. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He stood in the corner of the room, just out of my reach, as if daring me to approach him. He was silent, but his presence was suffocating. I could feel his gaze even though he never spoke. His eyes seemed to pierce into me, as if he was studying me, learning me. When I told Sarah about the dream, she said she'd had a similar one. In hers, the man was closer, standing right by her bed. And in the dream, she reached out to him. She said she could feel his cold touch, like ice running through her veins. We both laughed it off, convinced it was just stress from moving into a new home, from the constant oddities that had been happening. But the dreams didn't stop. They got worse. The man appeared in them more often, always watching, always waiting. And every time we woke up, we felt as though we had both been somewhere else, somewhere dark. And then there was the mirror. We found it in the attic, wrapped in an old sheet. It was a large, full-length mirror with a tarnished gold frame. When we uncovered it, the reflection didn't seem right. It felt wrong. It was as though it was reflecting something that wasn't there, something that shouldn't be. Every time we looked into it, we both saw shadows moving in the background, even when no one else was in the room. The mirror seemed to distort reality, bending the light in ways it shouldn't. That night I stayed up late, trying to figure out what was going on. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was haunting it. That's when I saw it, a figure standing behind me in the reflection. But when I spun around, there was no one there. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The figure was tall, just like the man in my dreams, and I could see his shadow moving out of the corner of my eye, even though he wasn't physically there. The house was changing us. We could feel it. The strangest part? I didn't want to leave. I should have wanted to. Something in me wanted to run, but I couldn't. There was something magnetic about the house, something pulling me in deeper. We had to know more. We had to find out what was really happening, and that meant delving deeper into the house's history. We weren't prepared for what we would discover next. The more we uncovered about the house, the deeper the mystery became. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from uneasy to downright suffocating. It was as if something, or someone, was watching us, waiting for the moment when we'd finally crack. Sarah and I spent more time researching the house, the previous owners, and any possible link to the strange happenings. But no matter where we looked, we always came back to one place, the attic. We hadn't explored it much after we first moved in. It was a dusty, dark space, cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and sheets of forgotten history. But there was something about it that felt wrong. Every time I went up there, I felt a weight in the air, like I was stepping into a place I wasn't supposed to be. And yet, every time we went upstairs, the attic door creaked open, beckoning us to look further. One night, after weeks of strange dreams and restless sleep, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go up there. I felt like something was calling me, pulling me toward the attic. Maybe it was a subconscious urge to understand the source of all this unease, or maybe it was just plain curiosity. But either way, I couldn't stay away any longer. I grabbed a flashlight, and Sarah, reluctant but equally compelled, followed me. The air up there was thick with dust, the musty smell of old wood and forgotten memories. We crept through the narrow walkway between the beams, moving carefully around the piles of abandoned things. There were old books stacked in piles, faded photographs in mismatched frames, and even some old furniture covered in sheets. But in the far corner, against the wall, was something that stood out, a large, heavy trunk locked with a rusted metal clasp. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it. There was something about the trunk that made my stomach twist, like it was holding something it shouldn't. "Do you think we should open it?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. I paused. "I don't know, but it feels like we have to." I reached for the lock. It was stiff, but after a few minutes of tugging, the metal finally gave way. With a creak, the trunk opened. Inside, there was a collection of old items, papers, photographs, and even some old clothing. But what caught my attention first were the journals. There were several of them, leather-bound, with pages that had yellowed with age. They looked like they had been written by someone who had spent a great deal of time documenting something. Sarah picked up one of the journals and flipped it open. Her fingers trembled as she skimmed through the pages. It's Michael's handwriting," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. I took the journal from her hands, my heart pounding. The pages were filled with strange entries, most of them difficult to understand, as if Michael was trying to put his thoughts into words but couldn't quite explain them. One entry stood out, dated just a few days before Michael and Claire left the house. "I can't escape it. The house has a way of making you feel like you're losing yourself. I thought it was just stress at first, but now I know the truth. It's not just the house. It's the thing that lives in it. It watches us, it waits, and I think it's feeding off our fear. The more we resist, the more it grows. Claire is starting to change. I can feel it too. We're both different. I don't know how much longer we can stay. There was more, but I couldn't read any further. My hands shook as I closed the journal. It felt like I was holding the key to something dark, something that shouldn't have been uncovered. "What does this mean?" Sarah asked, her voice full of dread. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky, "but I think we're dealing with something that goes beyond just a haunted house." The weight of his words settled on us. It wasn't just the house that was the problem. It was something in the house, something old, something powerful. We both stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The house had already taken so much from us, our sleep, our peace of mind, our sense of safety, and now it seemed like it was taking us down a path that neither of us was ready for. But we had no choice. We had to keep going. As I looked around the attic, I noticed something strange. There was an old, dust-covered mirror leaning against the far wall. It was small, just a handheld size, but something about it caught my eye. I walked over to it slowly, my hand reaching out before I could stop myself. The moment my fingers touched the glass, I felt a sharp chill. The temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to shift around me. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart pounding. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Sarah looked at me with wide eyes. "See what?" I turned the mirror over. On the back was a symbol, carved deep into the wood, almost like it had been burned into the surface. It was a strange, twisted shape, like a spiral, and in the center, there was a jagged mark, like a scar. I stared at the symbol, my mind racing. This was no ordinary house. Whatever had been left behind, whatever had been drawn into this place, it was older than we realized. This is bad," I said, my voice hoarse. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind us. A loud bang echoed through the house, shaking the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. The whispers from before grew louder, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching us. We were no longer alone, and we were starting to understand just how far this nightmare went. The attic door creaked shut with a violent slam, trapping us inside. My heart raced as the dim light from the flashlight flickered, casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house was closing in on us. I turned quickly, trying to open the door, but it was sealed. There was no visible bolt or latch. It was as if the door had become one with the walls themselves. "What's happening?" Sarah's voice was trembling, but her fear was quickly giving way to a strange sense of urgency. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, but the air around us felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every inch of the house seemed to be alive, breathing with an unnatural energy. The walls creaked, and the floorboards groaned underfoot as if they were shifting, adjusting to our presence. The mirrors, especially the one we had found earlier, seemed to reflect something more than just our own terrified faces. They showed something else, something hidden in the darkness. "We have to find another way out," I said, my voice forced calm as I scanned the room for any possible escape route. "Look for a window, anything." Sarah stepped toward the far corner of the attic, her steps slow, cautious. The shadows there seemed to grow, curling and twisting as she moved closer. I watched her, unsure whether to follow or stay put. My instinct told me to leave, but something held me back. A gut feeling, a whisper in my ear telling me that whatever was in the attic, whatever was alive in this house, was watching us. Then it happened. A sound, soft at first, came from within the walls. A tapping, slow, deliberate. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, just out of reach. A dull, hollow thud that seemed to echo in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah froze. Her eyes widened as she looked at me, her breath shallow. "It's in the walls." I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward me as the tapping grew louder. It wasn't a random sound. It was intentional, as if something was trying to get our attention. The knocking was rhythmic, almost alive, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I swallowed hard, glancing around the attic again. Everything was still, but something had changed. The shadows now seemed more defined, more menacing. They no longer moved with the flicker of the flashlight. Instead, they were stretching, reaching out, as if trying to pull us deeper into the darkness. "We need to leave," Sarah repeated, her voice shaking. "Now." I nodded and moved toward the window, hoping it wasn't sealed shut like the door. My hands fumbled with the latch, and to my relief, it opened easily. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and leaves. I could see the distant lights of the town in the distance, and for a moment, I thought we might actually make it out of here. But as soon as I turned back towards Sarah, I saw it. The mirror. It had moved. It wasn't leaning against the wall anymore. No, now it was standing upright in the center of the attic, facing us. I felt the blood drain from my face as my eyes locked onto the reflection. The man from my dreams was there, staring back at me. His hollow eyes, that twisted smile, his tall, gaunt figure. He was standing right behind us, inches from our backs. But when I turned around, there was no one there. He's in the mirror. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection. "Get out of here!" I screamed at Sarah. She was frozen too, her face pale, her body rigid with fear. She finally snapped out of it and bolted for the window. I followed her, but the moment we reached it, the tapping sound started again. Louder now, closer. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on us, pushing us toward the mirror. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was waiting for us. It wasn't just in the house, it was in us. This house was feeding on our fear, and it was getting stronger with every passing moment. Whatever had been awakened in that trunk, whatever had been locked away in the attic, had begun to unravel. I felt it. The weight in the air, the sense of something watching from every corner, from every reflection, from every shadow. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was breathing. The tapping was now joined by a low hum. A noise I couldn't place, but it felt like the house was calling us, begging us to stay. It was alive, and it had been waiting for us. For me, for Sarah. We had no more time to think. The mirror's reflection warped again, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distorted glass, I saw Sarah. But she wasn't herself. She was standing, yes, but her face was twisted in horror, her body jerking as if some invisible force had taken control of her. Her mouth opened, but instead of her voice, there was only a low, guttural growl. "Sarah!" I shouted, reaching for her, but she was already moving toward the mirror. Her body jerked again, like a puppet on strings, and her eyes were wide with terror. I pulled her back, desperate, but it was like trying to fight against a powerful current. The house was pulling her in, its grip tightening around us. And then everything stopped. The house went silent. The tapping, the humming, the oppressive air. It all went still. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought we were alone. But then I heard it. A voice. A whisper, faint at first, then clearer. "Leave, before it's too late." I turned to the mirror, but this time I couldn't see the man. Instead, all I saw was darkness. The reflection was gone, replaced by something far worse. Something waiting. We had to leave, but I knew, deep down, that it might already be too late. The silence in the attic was suffocating. It felt like the house had stopped breathing, as if everything had come to a halt. For a moment I thought we were free, that the house had let us go. But deep down, I knew better. I knew this was just the calm before the storm. Sarah and I didn't speak. There were no words left to say. The terror that gripped us was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was as if we were standing on the edge of something so dark and vast that we couldn't comprehend it, yet we felt it pulling us in. I looked at Sarah, trying to find something, anything familiar in her eyes. But what I saw terrified me. Her pupils were dilated, her skin pale, almost translucent, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She was trembling, and I could see the fear in her every movement. We both knew that we couldn't stay in the house. Whatever had been unleashed here, whatever had been stirring in the walls, was not something we could defeat. But as we stood there, frozen by the oppressive atmosphere, I realized with dread that leaving wasn't going to be so simple. The house had already claimed us. It was pulling us into its depths, and it wasn't going to let go that easily. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to get out. Now." She didn't respond. She just stared at the mirror, her eyes locked on the reflection that no longer showed her own image. There was nothing but darkness now. But I knew that something was waiting behind that blackened glass. Something that wanted us to come closer. The tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't just in the walls. It was in the floorboards, in the ceiling, in every corner of the attic. A low rhythmic sound that echoed through the house like a countdown. Like the walls themselves were preparing for something. A deep, hollow knock, followed by a pause, then another, louder, more insistent. "We can't stay," I repeated, my voice growing more frantic. Sarah blinked, snapping out of her trance. I don't know what's happening. What's happening to me?" I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to focus her attention. The terror in her eyes mirrored my own. Whatever had been in the house was taking hold of her. I could feel it too. It was in the air, in the very fabric of this place, wrapping itself around us like a suffocating cocoon. "We have to go. Now we're not safe here." But as I pulled her toward the window, I felt it again. The shift in the air, the feeling of eyes on us, watching, waiting. It wasn't just a presence in the house, it was the house itself. It was alive. Without warning, the attic door flew open with a deafening crash, throwing us both off balance. The light from the hallway was harsh, blinding, and in that moment I saw him again. The man. He was standing in the doorway, not in the reflection, not in the shadows, but in the flesh. He was tall, too tall for a man, his body unnaturally thin. His skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, and his eyes, they weren't just hollow. They were empty, vacant, like there was nothing left inside but darkness. And that smile, that twisted, impossibly wide smile. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, trapped in the presence of whatever had taken hold of this place. My heart pounded in my chest as the man, the thing, stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Behind him, the hallway seemed to warp, as if the house itself was shifting, changing, pulling us into its depths. "Leave, before it's too late," the voice whispered again. It was soft at first, then louder, as if it was coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse, desperate. I pulled Sarah toward the window again, but she wouldn't move. She was rooted in place, staring at the man, her face pale with terror. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's him. He's here." I didn't know what she meant. All I knew was that if we didn't leave now, it would be too late. The man, no, the thing was getting closer. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it then. The weight of his gaze, the pressure in my chest. He was feeding on our fear, and it was only going to get worse. I had to act. I yanked Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the window with all my strength, but she resisted, her body going rigid. "No, I can't," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't move. I can't leave him." I looked back toward the door, and the man was closer now, his face contorted in that grotesque smile. He wasn't moving, not in the way a person moves. It was like he was gliding, his feet never touching the ground. And then, as if sensing my fear, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice like 1,000 whispers at once, echoing in my mind. "Now you're mine." The last words sent a chill through my body, and I snapped out of the paralysis that had taken hold of me. With one final surge of panic, I dragged Sarah toward the window and threw it open. We didn't look back. We couldn't. But as we climbed out onto the roof, I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The house was still with us, and whatever had been waiting for us in that attic, whatever had been feeding on our fear, was going to follow us. It always does. I didn't know how we'd escaped, how we managed to get down to the ground, but somehow we did. As we ran from the house, I could hear it. The tapping, the knocking, the whispering. It was following us, just out of reach. The house hadn't let us go. Not yet. And I knew, as I glanced back at the dark outline of the house in the distance, that we would never truly be free. The man in the mirror, the thing that waited. They were still out there watching us, and they would come for us again. We didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. I think deep down, we both knew it was never really over. We had escaped the house, but the house hadn't escaped us. There was no way to outrun it, no way to hide. The thing that had been lurking within the walls, the man in the mirror, it was still out there, waiting, watching, feeding. Sarah and I stayed in a small hotel on the outskirts of town, as far from that cursed house as we could get. But even in the relative safety of the hotel room, we felt it. The heaviness in the air, the cold whispers at the edge of our consciousness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window made our hearts race. The house was always there, lurking in the background, a dark shadow that followed us, no matter where we went. I tried to convince myself that we were just traumatized, that we had simply experienced something, a figment of our collective imagination. Maybe we'd been so desperate to find an explanation for everything that our minds had created a story. But then, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man. The tall, gaunt figure, his hollow eyes, that twisted smile. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whisper, "Leave, before it's too late." I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. I wanted to believe that the worst was behind us, that the house was empty, abandoned once more, its secrets buried in the dust and the shadows. But I knew better. I could feel it, in my bones. The house would never be free of us, and we would never be free of it. One night, as I sat alone in the hotel room, staring out the window into the dark, I felt something shift. The air in the room grew heavy, colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and I shivered despite the heat of the room. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. A figure standing just outside the door. I rushed to it, flinging it open, but no one was there. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Something wasn't right. It was then that I saw it, a small piece of paper wedged under the door. At first I thought it was just a fluke, a trick of the light. But then I noticed the handwriting. It was familiar. I recognized it instantly. It was Michael's. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The words were scrawled hastily, almost frantically. "You can never leave. It has followed you. It will never let you go." My breath caught in my throat. I turned the paper over, expecting to find more, but there was nothing. Just that horrible, chilling warning. I ran to the window and looked out into the night. The town below seemed peaceful, still unaware of the darkness that was creeping in. The darkness that we had unknowingly unleashed. The darkness that would never let us go. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. The whispers grew louder. The tapping began again, this time more frantic, more urgent. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. And then through the window, I saw it. The house. It wasn't far. I hadn't noticed it at first, hidden behind the trees shrouded in the fog. But now as I stared, it seemed to loom larger than it had before. It was as though it was calling me, pulling me back, its dark windows gleaming with a malevolent energy. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out of the room. Sarah wasn't in the hotel. She had gone out earlier, trying to clear her mind, to escape just like I had. But I knew she wouldn't be gone for long. The house was already reaching out to her, pulling her back. I drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes darting nervously from side to side. The headlights barely cut through the fog, and the road seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. But I knew the way. I knew where I was going. The house. I don't know how much time passed before I reached the place. It felt like hours, like days. But when I pulled up to the front gate, I could see it clearly now. The house was no longer just a building. It had become something else, something darker. Its shape seemed to shift in the fog, as if it were breathing, alive, waiting. I parked the car, but before I could get out, I heard something. A sound, a voice, a whisper calling my name. "Come inside. It's waiting for you." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and made my way up the driveway, past the twisted, gnarled trees that had always seemed to watch me. The fog thickened as I approached the house, and I could feel the temperature drop. My breath came out in icy clouds as I reached the front door. It was open. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The house seemed alive, its walls groaning in protest, as if it were waking up, preparing for something. I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me, the fear that had been growing inside of me for so long coming to a head. "Sarah," I called out, my voice shaky. "Sarah, where are you?" No answer. Just the sound of the house breathing, the walls pulsing, the whispers growing louder. I stepped deeper into the house, my heart racing in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, the shadows dark and oppressive. I walked step by step, knowing I couldn't stop now. I reached the stairs, and that's when I saw it. The man. He was standing at the top of the stairs, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. His twisted smile stretched impossibly wide, and he began to move toward me, gliding silently across the floor. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice like 1,000 voices at once. I felt the fear rise up in my chest, choking me. But I couldn't turn away. I couldn't run. I was frozen, trapped in the house's grip. And then behind him, I saw Sarah. But she wasn't Sarah anymore. Her eyes were dark, empty, like his. She stepped forward, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "Help me!" The words echoed in my mind, a scream trapped in the walls, in the mirrors, in the very heart of the house. And I understood. The house wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, a predator, and it would never let us go. Not now, not ever.